Hey there. Tonight, we begin with something azad. Not like goose down or velvet drapery. Those were reserved for kings and extremely pampered cats. No, this is the softer kind of soft. The kind that comes from old straw muted candlelight and the collective sigh of a household settling into what they assumed would be 8 hours of rest, only to be gently interrupted by biology, theology, or a goat. Before we drift too far, make sure you're comfortable. Take a slow breath. Maybe pull the blanket just so until it hugs the tip of your nose. Now let's ease into a time before electricity, when nighttime arrived uninvited and stayed until it was good and ready to leave. Our story begins predictably with darkness. In the year 1347, or maybe it was 1322. The documents are unclear and frankly disagree with each other. There lived a family of peasant farmers in a small English village named, well, it wasn't named. If it was, the sign had long since fallen into the mud and been reappropriated as firewood. The father's name was Tom, because that was a requirement at the time. The mother, Agnes, and their 3 children, Edmund. Little Tom, a different Tom, and Brigitte lived together in a single-room cottage made of wattle daub and the kind of architectural optimism that collapses in heavy rain. Their bed, singular, was a straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame. It creaked, not when moved, but simply when looked at. Around it lay bundles of worn wool, the occasional dog, and something that might have once been a cushion, but now functioned exclusively as a flea preserve. Each night, when the sun gave up, trying to shine through the fog, the family would shuffle into their bedtime routine. It was short. Remove shoes, stack them near the hearth, which hadn't worked properly since Pentecost, and clamber under the blanket in the order of age, temperature sensitivity, and personal grumpiness, and then they would sleep. Or, at least, they would begin what was known as first sleep. In medieval times, it wasn't just the peasants who engaged in this mysterious 2-act slumber. Monks did it. Nobles did it, though on cushions, less enthusiastic about hosting beetles. Even Geoffrey Chaucer casually mentioned it in his writing, as though segmented sleep was as common as stale bread. Which it was. First sleep typically began not at 10 p.m. or midnight, but whenever it got too dark to see your own feet. That could be as early as 6 p.m. in winter, which meant Tom and his family would climb into bed long before the rats had finished their evening arguments in the rafters. The sleep came easily. No blue light, no caffeine, no anxiety about forgotten emails or unresolved plot points in your favorite show. Just the slow cooling of the hearth and the hush of the fields disturbed only by a rooster, with no respect for schedules. After a few hours, usually 4, but who was counting? Tom would stir. So would Agnes, though she never admitted to it. Brigitte, being youngest and most susceptible to dramatic dreaming, often sat upright mid-snore and declared that the turnip had spoken. This waking period wasn't strange. It wasn't even remarked upon. It simply was. Some nights, Tom would poke at the fire, not with purpose, just to hear it crackle. Other times, he'd check the door latch for the 5th time, as if any thief would want their cracked bowl or half-sack of oats. Agnes might reach for her rosary beads or mutter small prayers she forgot to say before sleep. Occasionally, they'd talk. Not about grand things, no heated debates or revelations, just quiet mutterings about the pig's limp, or whether the neighbor was brewing ale, or something less charitable. This time, between sleeps, was known delightfully as the watch. It lasted an hour, maybe 2, or as long as it took for the fire to settle, and for their bones to remember they had another round of unconsciousness to perform. The children sometimes played, not loudly, and not for long, just simple games, thumb wrestling shadow puppets, or seeing who could stay silent longest, which Brigitte always lost. The house in these moments felt almost magical, not because it glittered or glowed, but because it didn't need to. The outside world was pitch black, and inside was simply there. A dim hush, a drafty roof, and the faint smell of cabbage stew clinging to the corners. And then, just as naturally as they had risen, the family would begin their second sleep. They didn't say good night again. That had already been said. Instead, one by one, they simply faded back into sleep, back into the familiar rustle of straw and the symphony of wheezing breath, back into the same dreams they had left an hour ago, as if their minds had bookmarked the page. And now, dear reader or listener, you might be feeling a little heavy in the eyes. That's fine. You're only in the watch. There's still a second sleep waiting. And we've only just begun our story. In the dim half-light that hovered between candle stubs and moon shadows, Tom shifted once again beneath the weight of the shared wool blanket now clinging to his shoulder with the persistence of an overly affectionate sheep. The fire, having burned its initial enthusiasm, gave off only a sulky glow, occasionally, releasing a soft pop as if in protest. The hour was unclear. No bells rang, no clocks ticked, and no rooster dared announce anything at this polite in-between time. Still, this was not unusual. The entire household had returned to their wakefulness with the sort of resigned grace only those accustomed to cold draughts and recurring joint pain could manage. Agnes sat upright, her eyes half open, fingers fumbling gently with her rosary beads, which lived in a small cloth pouch tucked beneath the bed's creakiest corner. It had been her mother's, and possibly someone else's mother's. Before that, the beads smoothed by generations of whispered regrets and hopeful bargains with distant saints. Beside her, little Tom stirred in his sleep, muttering something about a carrot that refused to be caught. Brigitte, predictably awake, lay flat on her back, staring at the thatched roof, as though the answer to all questions, why geese honk so loudly, why turnips are always shaped like disappointed hearts, why everyone has to share one blanket might be hidden among the spider webs. There was a subtle ritual to this part of the night, one that required no name or instruction. Tom would rise, slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and onto the packed earth floor, with a sigh that implied both age and quiet defiance. His feet found the familiar cold and the single wooden clog that had been missing its mate since Michaelmas. He didn't need both. Not for fire poking. Not for this. At the hearth, he knelt, not with the reverence of a prayer, but with the weary pragmatism of someone trying not to wake a soot-covered mouse. He prodded the embers with a stick that was not quite straight, watching as a few sparks responded with a drowsy stretch and a gentle hiss. He added a bit of kindling twigs saved from the last dry day in September, brittle and hopeful, and sat back to observe. The fire, flattered by the attention, grew modestly. In the corner, the family dog, whose name had shifted over the years from good boy to don't, raised an eyebrow and then lowered it again, unimpressed. Agnes murmured something soft, possibly a prayer, possibly a comment about the draft. It was hard to tell, and no one asked her to repeat it. Outside, the wind pressed itself against the cottage in waves, not quite a storm, but enough to remind them all that February had opinions. The walls creaked in response, and something that might have been a loose shutter or a particularly ambitious branch gave 3 polite knocks against the thatching. Brigitte sat up slowly, now fully awake, which in her case meant wearing a solemn expression usually reserved for funerals and misplaced spoons. "Are we supposed to do something?" she asked the room, her voice barely more than a breath. Tom looked over at her eyes, squinting in the faint glow. "Supposed to," he repeated, as if tasting the idea. "No, it's just the hour. You can think. Or not." She nodded, seemingly content with the permission to do nothing productively. Agnes, still gently counting her beads, added, "Some folks read, if they have words, or they pray, or mend." She gestured vaguely toward a basket in the corner where 3 socks, a ragged shirt, and a pair of gloves, missing most of their gloveness, huddled together like survivors of a failed expedition. I saw old Male weaving rushes in the dark once, Tom said, poking the fire again. Said it helped her sleep better the second time. That doesn't sound restful, Brigitte noted. Wasn't meant to be. Just was. This seemed to be the medieval way things weren't good or bad, efficient or not. They simply were. Time was an animal that wandered where it pleased. It was kept only loosely marked by bells or the sun or a neighbor yelling that the ale had gone off. So now, in the hush between sleeps, the family existed together, apart each wrapped in their own small tasks or lack thereof. Tom continued tending the fire, not because it needed it, but because he liked the sound it made. Agnes shifted her position, tucking her feet under her cloak, and murmuring about a draft coming from the wall with the least loyalty. Edmund, the middle child and most devoted sleeper, had managed to avoid all of this by curling into a shape best described as bread roll, with elbows snoring quietly into the straw. Brigitte, ever the thinker, reached for the bundle of twine and wooden buttons she kept near her pallet, and began stringing them together in no particular order. "You know," she said to no one, and everyone, "if we could bottle this time, this quiet, I think we'd all stop arguing about whose turn it is to stir the porridge." Tom grunted in agreement. Agnes said something about porridge not stirring itself. Even the dog gave a faint, approving snort. And that was it. No grand declarations, no sudden decisions. Just a family sharing a moment that, while profoundly unremarkable, stitched them gently together. The hour passed, the way all true things pass in silence and slow breath. No bells tolled the end. No celestial voice announced the beginning of second sleep. Instead, there was a kind of collective sigh, a turning inward, as if the air itself had reminded them it was time. One by one, they settled again, the blanket stretching awkwardly across knees and elbows, the fire dimming to a steady whisper, the night wrapping itself back around the cottage like an old coat pulled from a hook. Eyes closed, thoughts slowed. Dreams, once paused, resumed without apology. But not all were asleep. Not quite yet. Not everyone. One remained, of course, not out of rebellion or insomnia, but simply because sleep, like everything else in the cottage, did not always arrive when requested. Brigitte lay awake, eyes open to the dusty ceiling, where an ambitious spider had begun a diagonal trek from beam to beam, like it had a secret message to deliver. She didn't mind the spider. It was quiet, and unlike Edmund, it didn't kick. Her fingers toyed absently with the twine she'd been knotting earlier, though the purpose of the knots had escaped her several twists ago. Perhaps it would become a bracelet or a trap for small ideas. Either way, the act of tying something even loosely made her feel marginally more organized than she felt internally, which, at this hour, resembled a linen basket after wash day, folded with intent but sagging in the middle. The fire now reduced to a sleepy pile of orange-tipped charcoal gave just enough glow to define the edges of things. Tom's foot, for example, stuck comically out from the blanket like it had been exiled for misconduct. Agnes had finally surrendered to second sleep, her breaths slow and almost musical, with a whistle at the end that made Bridget smile without intending to. Even the dog, Don't, as he had come to be known, had slumped sideways, with his belly exposed, which was his way of declaring the room safe enough to let his guard down and his breath up. The wind outside had softened too, perhaps tired from earlier dramatics. Now it only rubbed gently against the shutters, like an indecisive house guest, unsure whether to knock or let itself in. Brigitte closed her eyes again, not because she felt particularly tired, but because staring at shadows only held so much novelty. Her thoughts, like slow-turning carts on a muddy road, bumped along with no destination. She thought about the goat. The goat had earlier that week found its way onto the roof. No one knew how. It had simply appeared there one afternoon, chewing reflectively and refusing to come down until offered something with a rind. She thought about turnips, which had formed an uninvited majority in their winter meals. She suspected they were planning something. She thought about the stars, which she couldn't see, but knew were still out there, blinking like distracted watchmen. And then, somewhere in the soft middle of that mental stew, she drifted not into full sleep, but into that strange meadow of almost dreams, where things seemed both absurd and reasonable. She was in a field, or possibly a very large rug, and everyone she knew was arguing over the proper way to sit on a barrel. Tom was winning because he'd brought a spoon and insisted that made him the judge. Agnes was nowhere to be seen, though someone had left a neat pile of folded prayers on a rock nearby. Edmund had turned into a turnip, which felt more symbolic than alarming, and little Tom kept insisting the goat was the rightful heir to the house and should be consulted before any further blanket disputes. The scene made perfect sense, and absolutely none. But as soon as Brigitte attempted to ask the goat a question, something about firewood, possibly taxes, she was jolted by a thump. Not loud, but sharp. A deliberate sound unlike the usual creaks and pings of the house settling into itself. She sat up. The room, still dark, still quiet, still full of the scent of wool and old ash, seemed undisturbed. She looked toward the door. It was shut, as it should be, the latch firmly in place. But she had heard it, not imagined, not dream-born. A real sound. She waited, heart slightly more awake than the rest of her. After a moment, another thump. This one softer, as though it had second thoughts. From the wall, not outside, not above, from within. She glanced at Tom, still asleep, his snore now in full harmony with Agnes's faint wheeze. The children still deeply committed to the theater of sleep. Even Don't Canine Sentinel and Champion of Suspicious Smells gave no sign of noticing. Brigitte, uncertain whether to be concerned or simply curious, shifted slowly off the mattress. Her bare feet met the chill of the dirt floor, which greeted her with its usual indifference. She took a cautious step toward the wall. It was the east-facing one, the one with the loose plank near the bottom, where the cold sometimes slipped through like a letter delivered by air. She knelt, pressed an ear to the surface. Nothing. And then, just as she considered returning to bed, another thump, more of a shuffle, really followed by the unmistakable sound of chewing. Brigitte blinked. It was either a rat, a miracle, or someone was snacking inside the wall. She leaned back slowly, considering her options. Wake the household over a nibble. No. They'd never let her forget it. Investigate further. Possibly. But she had no candle, no shoes, and no desire to touch anything that sounded like it might have teeth. Instead, she whispered into the dim, "You better not be the goat." There was no answer, but the chewing stopped. Brigitte waited. The fire gave one final crack. Then silence. Not the heavy, ominous kind, but the kind that feels like a shrug. She stayed there a moment longer, half expecting something else. Another thump, a sneeze, a tiny voice saying it was just passing through. But nothing came. Eventually, with the stiffness of someone who had just knelt on a forgotten bean, she stood and padded back to the bed. Don't opened one eye, then closed it again, with the dismissiveness of a creature that had heard far weirder things in his time. She slipped under the blanket, found a spot between elbows and knees and let the warmth settle over her again. The chewing did not resume. The wind remained polite. Her eyes drifted shut for real, this time, not from exhaustion, but from the gentle weight of knowing that whatever had been inside the wall, be it rat mystery or ghost, with dietary needs, had finished its business. Or perhaps it was simply waiting. Waiting as things often did for someone else to take notice. But Brigitte had returned to sleep, or something that resembled it closely enough not to be argued with. Her body relaxed her thoughts, no longer looping like a wagon wheel in a rut, and even her toes, previously tense with the memory of the cold floor, gave in to the promise of warmth and stillness. Stillness, of course, being a relative term in a room filled with 5 breathing humans, 1 dog a broom that occasionally fell over for no reason, and a very slow leak in the roof near the corner that everyone pretended didn't exist. At some indistinct hour later, a sound re-entered the scene. Not a chewing this time, nor a thump. It was a creak, but not the usual creak of floorboard or limb or Tom's left knee. This was the rare, distinct creak of a wooden chair shifting its loyalties. The chair in question lived by the hearth. It had once been part of a set, but its mate had been burned 3 winters ago during the great firewood miscalculation of Candlemas. Now it stood alone, with a back like a question mark, and 1 leg shorter than the others, which gave it an air of permanent uncertainty. No one sat in it if they could avoid it. But the creak came again, a little louder, and now it leaned forward as if considering a conversation. Don't the dog opened 1 eye, and this time kept it open. He lifted his head, slowly, nostrils, twitching ears, doing their best approximation of alertness, which at his age was more theatrical than functional. The chair creaked once more, this time followed by an audible sigh, not from the chair, but from the shadow beside it. A figure not tall, not wide, but extremely present, shifted within the dim, took a step that made no sound, and gently reached toward the hearth as if to warm hands that had long since forgotten what warm meant. The fire, long asleep, glowed faintly, as if recognizing the visitor and deciding not to make a fuss. The figure, neither ghost nor guest exactly, but something in between, sat in the questionable chair. It accepted the weight, adjusted with a groan that might have been would, might have been protest, and settled. There was no face to see, not in that light. Just an outline of someone or something wearing the shape of memory. Don't did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, he quietly stood, walked across the room with the deliberate dignity of a beast who had once chased chickens, but now preferred watching them fail to fly, and curled up beside the figure's feet. The figure patted his head very softly. It wasn't cold. That was the strange thing. The room had been chilly, yes, but the presence didn't bring with it the expected draft or unnatural breeze that usually followed unexplained visitors. If anything, it seemed to warm the space slightly, like a memory of a fire rather than the flame itself. Brigitte stirred, but didn't wake. Her hand still loosely wrapped around the twine from earlier twitched. Once, then, went still again. Tom muttered something about lentils and turned over. The figure looked around, not hurried, not curious, just looking as though checking in on something left behind. And then, as quietly as it had appeared, it stood. The chair creaked in relief, then leaned back to its usual position of uncertain rest. The figure moved toward the wall, the one where the chewing had occurred. It placed a hand upon the plank, held it there, as if in greeting, or perhaps negotiation, and gave a soft push. The plank, once loose but stubborn, gave way with a sigh of old dust. Behind it, only darkness, the kind that doesn't sparkle or hum, just dark. The figure stepped forward and without further ceremony vanished into the wall. The plank gently fell back into place. A moment later, the dog, now alone once again, gave a soft huff and returned to his spot near the bed, curling up with the resignation of someone who knows better than to ask questions at this hour. Morning was still far off. The moon had moved slightly, revealing a sliver of silver light that crept across the room and touched the corner where the broom leaned still standing for now. Tom groaned in his sleep. Agnes muttered a half-prayer about spoiled onions, and Brigitte, though not quite conscious, smiled faintly and whispered, "Not the goat," before slipping deeper into dreams. All was quiet again. The house breathed. The night held its breath. The chair, though now empty, seemed a little straighter, as if remembering how to support someone properly. And just as everything began to return to its resting hum, just as the room settled back into the fragile peace of shared air and woven silence, there came a new sound. Not a thump, not a creak, not a chew, but a soft, rhythmic tapping. From under the floor came the tapping, not aggressive, not hurried, but methodical, like someone counting aloud, using only their knuckles, and a mild sense of rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap, longer pause, then a drag, as if something not quite shaped for this world had paused to consider a change in tempo. The house, to its credit, did not react. It had seen many things, though no one had asked it directly. Windstorms, drunken neighbors, an incident with the chimney. Goose no one discussed anymore. But this sound, this deliberate percussion against the packed earth and worn boards, felt new. Don't having to just achieved a satisfactory sleeping position with his tail nestled against his nose, lifted one ear without lifting his head. The ear swiveled in slow motion, listening, deciding, then resumed its previous position, like a curtain drawn against an unpleasant draft. Brigitte, still wrapped in the final folds of dream, shifted in her sleep, mumbling something about lanterns and needing exact change. Her fingers twitched once, as if attempting to flick away a bothersome idea. The sound continued. Not louder, not closer. Just there. Tap, tap, tap. Drag. As though someone or something beneath the cottage was navigating by feel, by ancient memory, or possibly by an extremely specific dance routine. Tom stirred now, his brow furrowing in that way it did when dreaming of Det's turnips, or both. He let out a breath that carried the faint whistle of a broken nose long since healed incorrectly, and muttered, "Not the spoon," again, which may have referred to an actual spoon or a metaphorical one with unresolved significance. Agnes, who in life had learned to ignore most things between the hours of midnight and sunrise, unless they smelled like fire or guilt, exhaled deeply and rolled toward the warmer side of the blanket, which happened, as always, to be occupied. The tapping persisted. Tap, tap, tap. Drag. A patient rhythm, almost polite, like a neighbor knocking on a shared wall to request less enthusiasm from a party they were not invited to. The floorboards themselves, warped and worn from years of muddy boots and careless elbows, seemed unsure how to interpret the vibration. One creaked softly. Another shifted its weight. And then quiet. Long, still, uncommitted quiet. The kind that makes the ears work harder than necessary. Somewhere far off, perhaps in the woods, an owl hooted, but in a very nonchalant way, as if even it was unsure whether the moment called for it. Don't, whose instincts were old, but not entirely retired, finally lifted his head. He stood, shook once, and padded toward the center of the room, where the fire had dwindled to a glimmer, and the floor felt the most alive. He sniffed. Once, then again. Something below smelled like soil and moths, and an idea that hadn't been thought through. He sat as if to say, I acknowledge this. I am not endorsing it. Then the floor moved, just slightly, not in a way that would concern an architect, but enough that a few ashes in the hearth took it as a cue to settle more deeply into their own thoughts. One small wooden tile, more of a plank, really thin and slightly splintered from Brigitte's failed attempt to make it into a sled. Last winter, lifted a fraction of an inch, tilted, then returned. Not open, not removed, just tested. Brigitte's eyes fluttered open, not fully awake, not yet, but enough to register the dog, the silence, and the faint scent of damp roots. Don't, she whispered. The dog turned, met her eyes with a look that said quite plainly, I'm not doing anything, and returned his gaze to the floor. She sat up slowly, trying not to disturb the blanket ecosystem, and scooted herself toward the hearth. The air was cooler here, and her bare feet recoiled slightly as they met the chilled ground. She followed Don't's gaze, then pressed her hand lightly to the plank that had twitched. It felt warm, not hot, but definitely warmer than the rest of the floor, the kind of warmth that suggested it had recently been somewhere else, or was in the process of remembering how to be somewhere. She leaned closer, ear to the wood. Nothing. And then, faint, almost shy, a hum. Not a song exactly, but a vibration. Like someone humming through their teeth while trying to remain unnoticed. She pulled back, blinked, and did what any reasonable girl in a cold cottage at night might do. She knocked. Once, then twice. The plank remained still. Don't tilted his head. She waited. Nothing. The humming stopped. The fire hissed softly. She reached again this time, sliding her fingers along the edge of the plank, feeling for a gap. It shifted slightly beneath her hand, and as she pressed it upward, it lifted not far, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness and the unmistakable smell of pine resin. Inside was not a tunnel, as she half feared and half hoped. It was a box, wooden, carved dusty as an unused tail. She lifted it gently and set it on her lap, brushing away cobwebs with the sleeve of her night shift. The lid bore a strange engraving. Not letters, not quite symbols. More like patterns that had once meant something before memory got in the way. She hesitated, looked at Don't, who, sensing his role as guardian, had intensified, stood closer. Then, with the cautious care of someone unwrapping leftover bread, not entirely sure if it's still bread, she opened the lid, Inside the box, lay a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be old linen, too finely woven to be anything her family had ever owned, and too neatly folded to be any cloth that had ever been used. It smelled faintly of lavender, which was strange, as no one in the household had seen lavender since the last traveling herb woman passed through town, muttering about goats with toothaches and blessings for sale. Brigitte paused, fingers hovering just above the bundle, then slowly lifted it from its resting place. It had weight, not much, but enough to suggest that something inside wanted not to be forgotten. Don't sniffed at it with mild suspicion, and then sat back down in a posture that implied supervision rather than participation. She unfolded the linen carefully layer by layer, half expecting dust to puff out dramatically, or for a mouse to leap from within, clutching a deed to a haunted well. But what emerged was neither threatening nor particularly revealing. It was a small wooden object, round flat, and carved with a pattern of concentric circles that seemed to move if one looked too long. Brigitte turned it over. On the other side was something pressed into the surface, a delicate indentation. Not quite a symbol, not quite a picture, but evocative of both. It looked vaguely like an eye, or a wheel, or perhaps a turnip viewed from an unusually artistic angle. She held it up to the hearth's faint light. The fire obligingly flared for just a moment, illuminating the carving with a flicker that made her blink. Don't leaned in slightly. Brigitte squinted. The lines seemed to hum, not in sound, but in suggestion, as though whatever this thing was, it had a memory of its own, and preferred to be handled with purpose. She turned to check the box again, but there was nothing more inside, just the folded cloth perfectly creased, and a whisper of air that didn't belong to the room. She picked it up again. The carved object, not warm, but not cold either, seemed to hum gently against her palm now. Not menacing, just aware. Aware of being noticed, maybe for the first time in a very long while. She whispered, "What are you then?" As if the object might reply. It didn't, of course. It just sat there inert, but curiously present, like a visitor at a feast who contributes nothing to conversation, but cannot be ignored. Brigitte looked to Don't, who responded with a blink that offered no real insight, but at least confirmed she wasn't alone in the matter. The plank from which the box had emerged now looked completely ordinary. Again, flat, disinterested part of the floor. There was no sign that it had ever shifted, no trace of whatever tapping had announced the box's arrival. She considered waking Tom, but discarded the idea with the kind of quiet finality that comes from knowing exactly how much disbelief her father could carry at 3 in the morning. Agnes would mutter something pious and suggest burning it or burying it in salted earth. Little Tom would try to eat it. Edmund would sleep through a thunderclap and would certainly sleep through this. So she held it alone. The object didn't glow, didn't whisper, didn't do anything dramatic. It merely existed with the stubborn stillness of something waiting for its context to return. She wrapped it back in the linen, for now returning it to the box with the care one might reserve for a story not yet finished. The box, though plain, felt oddly lighter once emptied, as if its task had passed to her, and it could finally relax into being furniture. She slid it under the bed for the time being. Not hidden, just tucked away, like a letter you're not yet ready to read again. Outside, the wind shifted, not stronger, but colder, brushing past the edges of the window with the cautious curiosity of something checking to see if it was welcome. Brigitte returned to her spot beside her siblings, pulling the blanket over her legs, now alert, but unsure what to do with her alertness. Don't lay beside her, not touching, but near enough that the warmth of fur brushed the back of her hand. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to think better in the dark. The lines of the carving lingered in her memory, spiraling and curling, like a path she hadn't yet been invited to walk. What was it? Why was it there? And more pressing, how long had it been under the floor? Had Tom built the cottage on top of it, without knowing? Or had someone placed it there after a gift or a warning, too easily mistaken for one another? Her thoughts circled until they tangled. Perhaps, she reasoned, the object was simply that a carved trinket, a relic left by a previous tenant who also liked spiral patterns and lavender. Perhaps it was nothing more than wood and whimsy, and she had imagined the hum and the warmth and the odd weight. But she couldn't quite believe that. Not fully. Not with the way it had made the floor feel different. Not with the way Don't had reacted. Not with the strange tapping that had stopped just before she found it. The fire gave another sigh, sending a faint puff of smoke up the chimney and back into the room, as it often did when the wind was in the mood to meddle. Brigitte coughed softly and pulled the blanket over her nose. She lay there in the glow of the near-dying fire, the image of the carved lines etched into her thoughts, and just as her breathing began to slow and her muscles forgot their curiosity, a new sound joined the room. A low, deliberate scratch, this time from the inside of the wall. The scratch began faintly, just beneath the audible range of waking concern, like a mouse reviewing a manuscript, but it grew in confidence with each drag of whatever instrument was at work behind the wood and plaster. Not hurried, not angry, but purposeful, as if someone had finally located the correct wall and was now carefully annotating the instructions they'd left behind decades earlier. Brigitte did not sit up this time. She simply opened her eyes and turned her head slightly toward the sound. It came from the same wall where the plank had shifted, not far from the fire, but higher, now just above eye level, if she were standing. She remained still, beneath the blanket, heart calm, but curious, aware of don't beside her, and the weight of the carved object wrapped safely in the linen beneath her bed. She whispered, just barely, "Do you hear that?" And don't, who had already been listening with the still patience of something bred to observe. Burrowing creatures let out a soft chuff that did not alarm, but acknowledged. The scratching continued. It wasn't frantic. There was rhythm to it, the kind that suggests not infestation, but intention. Brigitte rose slowly, gently, displacing the folds of the blanket so as not to rouse Edmund, whose arm now flopped across her former position, with the dramatic flourish of a person deeply committed to unconscious theater. She stepped carefully toward the wall, each footfall a negotiation between cold stone and warmer patches of woven rushes. The wall itself looked no different. It still bore the same pattern of soot smudges, the same nail where Tom once hung a ladle just to see if it helped with the draft, and the same faint watermark from a roof leak that had since made peace with the ceiling. Yet behind it, the sound continued. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Pause. Then again. She pressed her ear to the wall, half expecting a voice, a breath, even a heartbeat, but all she heard was the slow, deliberate motion of something drawing shapes into silence. "If you're a rat," she whispered, "you're unusually well organized." The scratching paused just long enough to feel like a response, then resumed. She glanced down at Don't, who had taken a seat near the hearth, watching her with the look of an old companion who has already lived through one too many tales and prefers his involvement to be editorial rather than active. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against the wood where the sound was strongest. The scratching stopped. She held her breath. Nothing. She pulled her hand away, and the scratching started again. Only now it was slightly lower, as if whatever was on the other side had followed the heat of her skin and was considering the etiquette of introductions. She reached beneath the bed and retrieved the box, its wood now cool again, its linen contents undisturbed. She unwrapped the carved object and held it near the wall, not pressing, just letting it hover there like a question waiting to be asked properly. The sound stopped. There was a long stillness, then a knock. Just one. From inside the wall, a soft, deliberate tap that had none of the accidental enthusiasm of a rodent. Brigitte didn't flinch. She simply exhaled and said in the quietest voice she could manage without becoming entirely invisible, "I have it." Another pause. Then, unbelievably, another knock. 2 this time, as if to say, "Yes, you do." She set the object gently on the hearthstone. The lines in its carving now seemed to pulse slightly, not light, not movement. Exactly, but as if they had remembered how to breathe. She turned back to the wall and considered the plank again this time, the one just above the one from before. With one careful finger, she tapped it. The wall answered, not with a knock, not with a scratch, but with a shift, a faint settling, the sound of something unlocking, not with a clink, but with a sigh. Brigitte stepped back. A small panel, no wider than a loaf of bread, and no taller than "Don't." When seated, slid forward from the wall by half an inch. It looked like a normal board, but it moved with a purpose that suggested it had waited longer than any person reasonably should to be acknowledged. She leaned in gently, tugged it forward, and it swung open silently on a hinge she could not see. Behind it was not another room, nor a tunnel, nor even a hiding place. It was simply a space. A gap in the wall, lined with something dark stone, perhaps, or old wax, hard to tell, and within that space sat a second object, smaller than the first, round but smooth, made of something like bone or polished wood, difficult to say in the low light. It gave off no glow, no hum, but it looked at her in the same way the first object had not, with eyes, but with presence. She reached for it slowly, her fingers curling around it, as though it might resist. It did not. It came free, easily, resting in her palm with the weight of a promise unspoken. She brought it to the hearth, placed it beside the carved disk. They did not react to each other, not visibly, but the air in the room changed. Not colder, not warmer, just fuller, as though something very old had quietly remembered its name. She sat beside them, both legs tucked beneath her, watching the pair of silent artifacts that now sat together on the stone like two pieces from a game no one had played since before the cottage had walls. Don't curled beside her. The fire crackled, once grateful to be included, and Brigitte whispered more to herself than anything. Now what? The wall, of course, had no answer. But it no longer scratched. Instead, behind it, something began to tick. Sigh. Behind the wall, the ticking began, as faint as a breath between two thoughts, rhythmic, but without rush, like a clock that had decided time didn't need to be watched so much as listened to. Tick, tick, pause, tick, tick. It wasn't quite mechanical, at least not in the way Brigitte understood mechanisms, which generally involved jammed drawer hinges and her uncle's one-legged butter churn. This ticking had no urgency, no countdown. It felt more like something ancient stretching its limbs after a long nap, reacquainting itself with the sound of its own motion. She leaned toward the wall again, placing her hand gently against the plank that had revealed the compartment. The surface was still cool, but beneath it, she could feel the slightest tremble, like a pulse deep within the cottage's wooden bones. The two objects on the hearth remained unmoving. The carved disc, with its concentric spirals, rested beside the smooth, round piece, which now reflected the firelight with a softness that suggested it had once been polished by many hands, or by none at all, but dust and waiting. Don't stirred repositioned his weight with a sigh, and rested his head on his paws with the stoicism of a creature resigned to being present for whatever this night decided to become. Brigitte stared at the two items. She had expected them to do something, perhaps glow, or hum in agreement, or unfold into a map that led somewhere inconvenient. But they merely sat there, solid and quiet, as if their job was not to perform, but simply to be near each other again. She reached for the smoother object and held it in her hand, feeling its weight. It was lighter than the carved disc, warmer too, and the surface was marked with the faintest of ridges, like fingers once traced something over and over until it became part of the object's skin. Turning it slowly, she found no writing, no obvious opening or mechanism. Yet the moment her thumb passed over a small indentation near the edge, the ticking from the wall shifted. It quickened, not alarmingly, but like it had recognized a tempo it preferred and was eager to return to its routine. Tick, 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 tick. The pattern grew more intricate, more deliberate, though still subtle enough that anyone else in the room would mistake it for the house settling, or a beetle trying to start a conversation with the floorboards. Brigitte pressed her thumb gently into the indentation again, and the smooth object clicked not loudly, more like the sound of a page turning in a very old book. At the same moment, the carved disc on the hearth rotated slightly on its own, just a few degrees, as though adjusting its view of the room. She blinked, looked at Don't, who now stared intently at the hearth, like he was watching a performance of great restraint. Then she noticed something stranger. The light from the fire, previously static in its flickering dance, now moved in a pattern. It wasn't brighter, but it shifted, casting shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. Long vertical shapes, like trees or pillars. Then a brief outline that looked suspiciously like a door. Brigitte turned her head, expecting to see someone or something beside her. But there was only the empty room, the gently breathing lump of Edmund, the unmoving silhouette of the table, and the ever-loyal broom that still hadn't fallen. But the shadows continued to dance, not according to the fire's whim, but to the pulse of the ticking. She leaned in her hand, still holding the smooth object, and brought it close to the carved disc. The moment they touched very lightly, not even fully pressed together, the ticking stopped. All at once, not a fade, not a wind down, just silence. And in that silence came the softest whisper, not in her ear, not aloud, but somewhere just behind thought, like a dream. You remember only the tone of. It said simply, "Not yet." Brigitte withdrew her hand. The ticking resumed. The shadows resumed. The disc rotated back to its original position. Don't let out a small sneeze which felt oddly well-timed. Brigitte sat back on her heels and stared. "Well," she murmured, "you're temperamental." She wasn't sure who she meant. The objects, the wall, herself, perhaps. She wrapped the smooth piece back in its cloth and set it gently in the box, then reached for the carved disc, but paused. It was slightly warmer now, as if it had done a little work, and was pleased with itself. She placed it next to the other, not touching, but within reach, like two chess pieces, still unsure if they were on the same side. The fire crackled once, releasing a curl of smoke that briefly formed the shape of something familiar, possibly a sheep, possibly an umbrella, depending on one's need for symbolism. She sighed and sat cross-legged beside the hearth arms wrapped around her knees, watching the play of light and listening to the rhythm that had returned to the wall. Behind her, the house continued to sleep. Agnes muttered something that might have been a hymn, or might have been a complaint about lentils. Tom shifted and made the universal sound of someone dreaming about something mildly disappointing. Outside, the wind had grown bored and wandered elsewhere. The stars, still invisible from the inside, blinked above the thatched roof without offering opinions. Brigitte watched the objects and whispered, "What are you waiting for?" The disk didn't answer. The wall ticked gently, and just as she began to wonder if perhaps nothing else would happen, that the night had reached its odd crescendo and was now descending into stillness again, something in the far corner of the room, a corner she had not thought about in years, gave a sudden, quiet click, like a door unlocking that no one remembered existed. The click was so soft, it might have been mistaken for the settling of a beam or the final sigh of a cooling ember. But Brigitte, who had been listening to nothing in particular for quite a while now, recognized it immediately as something new. It came from the farthest corner of the room, the one behind the old flour bin, which no longer held flour, but a confused assortment of items that had never quite found their true calling. Half a wooden spoon, a cracked bowl filled with buttons of no matching sizes, a single mitten that had declared independence from its mate 2 winters ago, and a small broom used only for show, if at all. No one had given that corner much thought. It was dim, inconveniently shaped, and slightly colder than the rest of the room, as if it had been assigned the personality of a corner, rather reluctantly. Brigitte turned slowly, her attention peeling away from the objects on the hearth and toward the source of the sound. Don't raised his head. Again ears forward, now tail still. There was no movement, no breeze, not even a shift in the shadows, just a sense that something had acknowledged her attention and was considering what to do with it. She stood carefully, brushing dust from her knees, and padded over to the corner, the floor beneath her feet, creaking with familiar complaint. As she approached, she saw it. A seam in the wall that hadn't been there before, not dramatic or glowing, just a line. A vertical split between 2 boards that now suggested a doorway so subtle it could only be seen when one was actively searching for something they didn't yet know existed. The boards themselves bore the same grain, the same nail marks, the same soot-darkened hue as the rest of the wall, but now they were separate. Just slightly. Just enough. She reached out, fingers hovering over the seam, and paused. The air here felt different. Not musty, not fresh, but deliberate, as though it had been kept aside for a particular moment, and now having waited patiently, was finally allowed to breathe again. She pressed her hand gently to the seam. It gave, not swung open, not creaked on hidden hinges. It simply gave like parchment curling from warmth or old dough rising in a bowl. A narrow space appeared just wide enough for a small girl, a large dog, or a secret too shy to speak. Behind it, no room, no tunnel, just stairs, narrow ones, descending into what should have been earth, but which now hummed faintly with that same ticking rhythm, slower now, almost content. Brigitte looked over her shoulder. The room behind her remained unchanged. Her siblings slept. The fire flickered. The objects on the hearth sat still. But the air in the room leaned slightly toward the stairs, like a held breath, drawn forward by memory. She turned back to the opening and said quietly, "Well then," not as a decision, but as an observation. Don't rose and followed his claws, tapping gently on the floor. The only sound other than the now steady tick that came from below. Together, they stood at the top of the steps. They were carved from stone, not new, not ancient, the kind of age that simply felt appropriate for stairs that had waited without resentment. Brigitte stepped down one foot after the other, hands brushing the walls for balance. The air was cool, but not damp still, but not stale. It smelled faintly of old paper and a spice she couldn't name, but that reminded her of our market days and dried herbs hanging in unfamiliar stalls. The ticking grew clearer with each step, though it never grew louder. It was everywhere now, woven into the stones, into the walls, into the very breath she took. At the bottom, after what felt like 30 or so steps, but might have been fewer, if not for the careful way she counted when unsure there was a small landing. A circular room, barely tall enough for Tom, with shelves built into the stone itself. Upon them sat objects, not many, and none arranged with the kind of precision that suggests cataloging, but rather the kind of thoughtful scattering that says each item remembers where it belongs. Small boxes, some sealed, some open. Scrolls tied with cords the color of dry moss. A cup with something inside that shimmered faintly, but not invitingly. A bell with no clapper. A book with no title. Its spine wrapped in thin strands of metal that looked like they had been grown rather than forged. In the center of the room sat a pedestal plain stone with a shallow bowl resting on top. Brigitte approached. Don't at her side. Both of them silent in the way one is silent when they realize they have not entered a place so much as been allowed into it. In the bowl sat a third object, roughly the size of the two upstairs, but different. Not round. Angular. Shaped like a piece of something larger, as if it had once been part of a whole that had been thoughtfully, or perhaps regretfully taken apart. She reached out, hesitated, then let her fingers rest lightly on the edge. It was cold, then warm, then neutral, like it was cycling through reactions before settling on one that matched hers. She picked it up. It was heavier than the others. Solid, in the way old promises are solid. The ticking paused again, a long, thoughtful pause. And from somewhere beyond the stone, not near, but not far, came a new sound. Not mechanical, not natural, but unmistakably alive. A voice, not a word. Just the sound of a voice beginning to form one. Brigitte turned slowly, the object in hand, and looked toward the far end of the circular room, where the stone wall no longer looked quite as still as it had a moment ago. The wall that wasn't supposed to move or speak, or even be anything more than supporting architecture, now rippled, not like water, but like something deep beneath the surface had remembered it was supposed to do something about now. The stone didn't crumble or crack. It simply gave the impression that it was thinking about becoming something else. The voice that had begun as a hint was still not words, not yet, but it had shape now. Resonance, a soft murmur that brushed against the edges of Brigitte's thoughts, like fingers sifting through a drawer of old letters. She didn't move closer, not out of fear, but because something told her the voice would arrive when it was ready, and rushing, it would be about as productive as arguing with yeast. Don't sat at her side, not trembling, not curious, just present his eyes on the shifting stone. His body perfectly still, except for the slow, steady twitch of one ear, as if he were picking up a frequency too old for human bones. The object in Brigitte's hand grew warmer, not hot, but warm, in a way that suggested it had not been touched in a very long time, and was now adjusting to the fact that it had, against all odds, been retrieved again. She turned it slowly in her palm. It was angular, like a fragment of something once symmetrical. Each side was etched with lines that didn't match, but didn't clash either. Some sharp, some curved, some looping back on themselves, like a thought trying to rewrite its conclusion. The pedestal where it had rested stood empty now, looking somewhat relieved, as if the bowl had been waiting for centuries to stop holding on to something that wasn't really its problem. The walls of the room seemed to lean in slightly, not physically, but perceptibly, the way a room does when it wants you to pay attention without making a scene. Brigitte stepped slowly toward the place where the stone had rippled. The voice was clearer now, though still unformed. It carried the weight of many languages, not layered, but overlapping gently like leaves in a pond, not meant to be translated, just felt. It did not demand. It suggested. And what it suggested was simple, place the piece. But there was no slot, no clear surface, no diagram, just the wall smooth as stone should be. Only now it pulsed faintly with that same ticking rhythm. Tick, tick, pause, tick. She looked down at the object in her hand, then up again. A pattern had begun to emerge on the wall, subtle at first, just a series of faint lines that hadn't been there a moment ago, forming a shape not unlike the carved disc upstairs, but incomplete, as if waiting for someone to draw the rest of the picture from memory. Brigitte reached out, and the closer the object came to the wall, the clearer the lines became. Not glowing, not buzzing, just becoming. She aligned the piece gently to the center of the shape, and when the angles matched just so, it slid in without resistance. A soft click followed. Then stillness. Complete enveloping stillness. Even the ticking stopped. The voice paused. Even "don't blinked," and held it longer than a blink ought to be. Then the wall began to recede, not dramatically, not in a grand flourish of dust and echoes, but with the quiet competence of something that has waited long enough and is finally getting on with it. The stones folded inward, revealing an arch just wide enough for one person or one question to pass through. Beyond it was a hallway, dimly lit by a glow that didn't come from flame or sun or anything Brigitte could explain, but felt familiar in the way certain smells unlock memories you didn't realize were stored behind your knees. She looked at Don't. He looked at her. They stepped through together. The hallway was narrow, curved slightly, and the walls were lined with more shelves. These ones, more densely packed with items that ranged from the clearly useful scrolls, small tools, jars, labeled in careful handwriting, too tidy to be Tom's, to the clearly ceremonial masks carved from bone, a string of bells that made no sound, a jar of what appeared to be folded paper birds that shifted slightly when not looked at directly. At the end of the hallway, a second room opened circular again, but larger, and in the center stood a table. Not a grand table, not even particularly symmetrical, just a table shaped like someone had built it out of memory and approximation. Upon it were 3 indentations, one round, one smooth, one angular. The 3 pieces. Brigitte stepped closer. She felt the linen-wrapped objects in her pocket still warm. The room did not press for action. It waited patiently. The air here was older than the house above. It smelled of stone and ink and something else, something like dried lavender and charred pine, the scents of forgotten rituals and remembered winters. Brigitte took the carved disc, placed it into the round indentation. It fit with a soft sigh, as though the stone was relieved to remember what shape it had been holding space for. She unwrapped the smooth one and placed it in the second. It gave a small hum, like a bell rung in a memory rather than in sound. The third piece, already seated in the wall behind them, now pulsed softly, casting a faint light across the room that made the shelves appear to breathe. As the last piece settled, the table itself shifted, not lifted, not spun, just shifted, like a thought adjusting mid-sentence. A series of lines emerged across its surface, faint at first, then bolder. A map, but not of land, not of roads, a map of something else entirely. Places that didn't have names, connections that didn't follow rivers or kingdoms, but something more internal, like dreams charted through memory. Brigitte reached out her fingers, tracing one of the paths, and as she did, the walls around her began to echo, not with sound, but with a return of ticking, a return of breath, a return of memory, not in sharp bursts, but in slow, deliberate ripples, as though the room itself had begun recalling its purpose after so long sitting quietly behind the walls of a home that only asked it to stay out of sight. Brigitte's fingers moved gently over the lines etched into the table lines that didn't feel carved, but grown emerging, as though her presence alone coaxed them out from hiding. The shapes didn't form anything she recognized. No villages, no coastlines, no markers of the world as she knew it, but they weren't abstract either. They curved with intention, met each other at soft intersections, and pulsed faintly beneath her touch, like old roads remembering footsteps. Don't watched from the edge of the room. His eyes, reflecting the strange glow with a calmness that suggested even dogs, when properly aged and moderately wise, could appreciate the logic of forgotten architecture. The lines on the table continued to emerge, and with them, small symbols began to appear. Not letters, not numbers, but something in between glyphs that felt like they had once been spoken in a dream, and then left behind like breadcrumbs. Brigitte whispered one aloud, not with certainty, but with that instinct that sometimes guides a tongue to wrap around unfamiliar shapes, and the air responded, not with sound, with awareness. The wall across from her shimmered faintly, and for a moment It appeared not as stone, but as glass, behind which something stirred. Not clearly seen, but hinted. A movement, a suggestion, something on the other side listening in return. She leaned closer to the map, her hand hovering over a cluster of the symbols that radiated softly in a kind of half-glow, and just as she did, the carved disc on the table shifted, only slightly, but enough to change everything. Its spirals, once passive and decorative, began to turn not fast, but undeniably, as though turning back through time itself, or through an idea long set aside. The room deepened, not in size, but in sensation, as though more of it had just arrived, folded in from a place not far, but not quite here. The walls now carried texture where there had been smoothness before faint outlines of alcoves and panels, each one bearing its own quiet hum, like instruments waiting for their part in a composition long delayed. Brigitte stepped back from the table, not out of fear, but because she understood the moment required perspective. She looked around, letting her gaze rest on each new detail as it revealed itself, a recessed shelf to her left, now holding 3 small bottles each, corked and labeled in the same strange glyphs. A tapestry along the far wall, once too faded to see, now bearing threads of gold that sketched out a circular motif not unlike the carved disc, though this one included 4 smaller circles surrounding the center, one of which glowed faintly in time with the ticking that had resumed beneath the floor. It struck her then that this room was not just a chamber or a vault. It was a calendar, or perhaps a memory device, something built not to contain, but to recall piece by piece, moment by moment, as the right conditions were met. She turned back to the map and touched another symbol. This one shaped like an elongated leaf with 3 points. The glow shifted again, and a pulse ran through the floor, faint, like a heartbeat beneath centuries of sleep. And then she heard it. Footsteps, not from behind, from beyond. On the other side of the wall, where the glass had shimmered, a figure passed. Not close, not visible, but there, moving, purposefully. She stared, holding her breath, but the figure did not return. The glass wall faded back into stone, leaving only a faint outline behind, like steam on a window that had briefly remembered another season. She looked at Don't. He tilted his head. She asked the room aloud, "Was that part of the remembering? Or is someone else awake?" The room declined to comment, but the carved disc now pulsed slightly faster, its spirals adjusting again. The smooth stone, her second retrieved piece, remained quiet, steady, as though its part had not yet come again. And then came a sound, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. A chime. One single note, perfectly round, echoing through the chamber, with the clarity of an idea finally spoken. It came not from the map, nor from the pieces, but from the pedestal in the corner that had once held the angular shard. Brigitte turned toward it, and found nestled in the bowl that had been empty since her retrieval of the final piece a key. Plain, unadorned iron. Yet as she stepped closer, it shifted in the light, revealing faint etchings along the shaft that matched the lines on the map. Not one door, many. Not one lock. A choice. She picked it up, and in her hand it felt solid, weighted like memory warm, like a hand held just a little too long. The moment she lifted it from the bowl, the lights in the room shifted, not dimmed, not brightened, but rotated, as if the source of illumination had moved, casting everything into subtly new angles. The tapestry's 4 surrounding circles now all glowed faintly, not equally, but as if 3 had been waiting, and 1 had only just remembered its purpose. Brigitte turned slowly the key in her hand, and the map before her began to fade. Not disappear, but dim, as though it had shown what it was meant to show for now. She stared at the table. The markings, the now still carved disc, and said softly, "There's more, isn't there?" The chamber, in its quiet way, answered, not with a voice, but with a new ripple of movement, this time from the ceiling above. The ceiling, which, until now, had behaved exactly as ceilings ought to quiet, supportive, uninterested in drama, began to change, not with cracking or collapse, but with a soft, almost apologetic groan, like a library shelf, rearranging its contents out of courtesy rather than command. Brigitte looked up the key still in her hand, its etched lines now pressing gently against her palm, as though aware of something happening above. Don't raised his eyes first, then his whole head ears, twitching once, in that way they did, when sensing something just beneath, hearing a sound more remembered than made. The ceiling had once been smooth stone, or had at least looked that way in the chamber's dim glow. Now, faint seams appeared barely visible, but unmistakably there forming a lattice of intersecting lines that made no ordinary pattern. These were not beams or rafters, not the kind of architectural choices made for keeping out the weather. These were marks of intention of function, as if the room had once needed to move in more directions than simply down. Brigitte stepped back from the table, still holding the key, and tilted her head, to follow the lines with her eyes. Where they met, in the very center above her, a circular plate slowly began to descend. Not quickly, not alarmingly, but with the dignified pace of something that had been waiting for a long time and refused to be hurried now that its moment had arrived. It rotated gently as it lowered, revealing a surface not of stone, but of something smoother, glossier, glass, perhaps, or something pretending to be glass, with just enough magic or memory to fool the eye. Upon it, more symbols, these ones arranged in a spiral pattern that echoed the carved disc still resting in its place on the table below. Brigitte held her breath as the plate hovered just above head height, and then stopped hanging in the air, with no visible support, casting a faint glow of its own cooler than the other lights tinged faintly with blue, like moonlight seen through frost. The symbols pulsed once in unison, then stilled. Beneath them, a small compartment, circular, subtle flush, with the surface slid open, with a sound like soft breath, revealing a single slip of parchment. Brigitte stepped forward, reached up, and removed it with care. It was cool to the touch, softer than she expected, and blank on both sides at first. But as she turned it in the light of the floating plate letters began to appear. Not written by hand, but drawn out from within the fibers of the paper itself, like dew lifting from grass at dawn. They were in the same script she had seen on the bottles and jars, the kind that didn't quite form an alphabet, but insisted on meaning all the same. She read aloud, not understanding the words, but feeling their rhythm, their weight. As she spoke, the key in her hand warmed the table behind her, hummed once, and the door through which she had entered, previously silent and unassuming, clicked again. A softer click than before. This one felt like an invitation. Don't stood now clearly ready. His body poised, but calm, as though he too understood this wasn't an ending or a danger, but simply the next paragraph in a very long book. Brigitte pocketed the parchment carefully, looked once more at the hovering disk above her, and stepped toward the door. As she reached it, she noticed something new, a second keyhole just beside the handle, nearly invisible, but now pulsing faintly with the same cool light as the sealing plate. She brought the key close. The light dimmed, steadied, then winked out as the key slid in with an ease that suggested it belonged not just there, but only there. The door opened outward into a passage she hadn't seen before. Not the stairs, she came down. Not a hallway, she remembered. This one was narrower, the walls lined with shelves of books. Real books, some so thick they seemed capable of holding their own opinions. others so thin they might have been whispers stitched together in leather. The air was warmer here, not oppressive, just inviting the way a room sometimes seems to know it's about to be read. Brigitte stepped inside. Don't followed. The door closed behind them, not rudely, but firmly, like a chapter ending precisely where it meant to. As they moved forward, the books shifted slightly on their shelves, some adjusting their angle, others sighing into place. A few titles appeared in languages she knew or half knew, scraps of reading from borrowed texts and stories told by candlelight. Others were written in scripts she didn't recognize, at all lines that curled and looped like smoke from a forgotten kindling. Ahead, the passage turned, and as she followed it, she noticed the faint hum again. Not ticking now, but a low, sustained tone, as though the air itself was singing under its breath. The walls changed color, gradually, still stone, but warmer, etched with murals that faded in and out, depending on the angle of the light. She could see glimpses of people not drawn in great detail, just impressions, someone opening a similar door, someone lifting a disc, someone sleeping beside a hearth, a dog standing watch. She paused, recognizing the last shape. Don't looked at the mural, too. Neither commented. Some things are best left to nods and glances. The hallway opened again, revealing another chamber. This one unlike the others, not circular, not stone, but rectangular, and lined with wooden panels. It felt older and newer all at once, as if time had passed differently here. In the center, a single chair faced a wall filled with drawers. Above the drawers, a symbol she now recognized, the spiral, but turned inward this time. The chair was empty. The room was quiet. But the drawers pulsed faintly, each with a small tag, each with a small lock. Brigitte stepped forward, key still warm in her pocket, and as she reached for the first drawer, something behind the panel breathed softly, patiently, like it too had been waiting to be opened. Brigitte stood still, hand hovering just above the first drawer. The warmth of the key in her pocket pressing gently against her leg, like a nudge from something unseen, but very much invested in the outcome. The breath she had just heard, if breath it was, had faded again into the soft hum of the room. And the air now seemed filled not with tension, but with anticipation, as though the entire space had leaned in slightly, holding its own lungs still in a quiet vote of confidence. The drawers themselves were uniform in shape, but each bore a small tag, delicately aged, and curled at the corners, marked with the same elegant script that had written itself into the parchment upstairs. She read the nearest one silently, known by stillness. Another to the right read, kept by absence. Others followed in similar tones, left by moth, held by fog, named by the last word. Not titles, not descriptions, more like hints or soft accusations. She reached for the one that read, kept by absence, and found her fingers tingling as they met the small iron latch. The drawer resisted just a moment, just long enough to ask her if she was certain, then slid open with a sigh, revealing nothing at all. Or rather, not quite nothing. The space inside felt heavy, not with objects, but with the idea of something having just left, like walking into a room, still warm, from someone else's presence. There was no dust, no forgotten artifact, just the unmistakable sense that whatever had once belonged here now lived somewhere else, but not far. Don't sniffed at the drawer, then sneezed once, as if the air there had tickled an old memory or a dusty conclusion. Brigitte closed it gently, and as she did, a soft click echoed from deeper within the wall of drawers, one of the other compartments unlocking itself in response. She turned toward the sound and saw another drawer, slightly larger, slide open on its own. This one had no tag, no name, just an open invitation. She approached it slowly, eyes scanning the wall for any sign of movement. None came. Everything remained still expectant, but not rushed. Inside the newly opened drawer was a cloth pouch tied with a ribbon, so faded it might once have been blue or green, or just a particularly thoughtful shade of gray. She picked it up. It was light, but not empty, and the ribbon unfurled the moment her fingers touched it, not untying itself dramatically, but loosening with the ease of something that had been waiting for permission. Inside the pouch was a pendant, round, simple, no larger than a coin, with an engraving of the spiral, this time enclosed in a square frame, the lines of the symbol slightly offset from center, as though it had shifted mid-thought. Brigitte held it in her palm. The pendant was cool, then warm, then settled at skin temperature, as if it had made a decision. Don't watched it carefully. His tail moved once, slow and steady. A kind of acknowledgement, usually reserved for things that lived outside of time and required no barking. The pendant gave no light, no hum, but its presence felt deliberate, like it had just told her something without using words, and she was now responsible for understanding what that meant. She placed it around her neck. The chain was finer than it looked, barely there against her skin, and the moment the pendant settled at her collarbone, the drawers around the room responded. Not all at once. not loudly, but in a slow cascade of soft clicks and creaks. They began to open, not wide, not entirely, just enough to say, yes, this is the moment. From within them came scents, lavender, ash, old ink rain on dry earth. None overpowering, just notes in a chord too complex to name. Each drawer now held something unique. A feather, a folded scrap of cloth, a spool of thread. With no end, a spoon with half its bowl missing, a pebble that shimmered faintly with colors not seen in sunlight. She walked past them slowly, not touching, only observing. Each item seemed to pulse slightly in time with the pendant's presence, as though they recognized it, or her, or the combination of the two. At the far end of the room, where the last drawer had yet to open, a panel on the wall began to move. This one didn't breathe or click. It slid quietly aside, revealing behind it not another corridor or shelf, but a mirror, large, dustless, too clean for a room so forgotten. Brigitte stepped toward it, her reflection emerging with a slowness that didn't feel delayed, just thoughtful. The mirror didn't simply show her. It showed her now, her earlier, her possibly a shimmer of moments layered together so gently they barely contradicted each other. She raised a hand. The reflection matched but a beat late. Not wrong, just on its own time. Dont's reflection stood beside hers, looking precisely as he always did, only a bit more certain if that was possible. Around the edge of the mirror ran a border of etched symbols, some from the map, some new, some she suspected had not been seen by anyone for a very long time. She reached out and traced one with her finger. The mirror rippled, not like water, more like breath. And behind the glass, for the briefest moment, something moved, a figure standing far off, not approaching, not fleeing, just there, then gone. The drawer beneath the mirror clicked. Brigitte bent to open it. Inside a book, small bound in a soft leather that felt like holding dusk in one's hands. No title. She opened it. Inside, one page only. The same phrase written in the language of the parchment upstairs. She could read it now. Begin where the spiral ends. She looked at the mirror again. The image had changed. The image in the mirror no longer reflected Brigitte, nor Don't, nor the quiet room with its open drawers and humming air. Instead, it showed a place she recognized, but couldn't name, a soft landscape of low hills and trees that looked too still to be caught by wind, lit by a sky that glowed in twilight's tones, but showed no sun, no stars. It felt like memory made visible, the kind of scene that exists not in space, but in the folds between moments where dreams sometimes pause to adjust their slippers. The pendant against her chest pulsed once gently, and the book in her hands warmed slightly, the leather growing softer, as though encouraging her to linger. She read the phrase again. Begin where the spiral ends. It wasn't a riddle. It didn't feel like a warning. Just a statement, quiet and sure, like directions from someone who had been down the path and left the sign facing only those ready to see it. The mirror shimmered again, and the hills began to move, not literally, but with the slow shift of seasons in fast-forward trees, darkening, then lightening, then blooming briefly in colors she didn't have names for. A path formed along the ridge, not a road, but a suggestion, the kind of trail left by careful feet that didn't want to disturb the grass too much. Brigitte stepped closer, the pendant warm now, in time with her heartbeat, and the mirror didn't resist. It welcomed. The surface softened like breath on glass, and though her fingers never touched it, the sensation that followed was like stepping into a remembered room, one she hadn't realized she missed until she felt the shape of it around her again. Don't followed silently, tail low posture, steady, neither alarmed nor excited, but deeply involved in the moment's logic. The world within the mirror accepted them without fanfare. No swirl of magic, no gust of displaced air, just a shift, like a page turning from one quiet paragraph to another. The hills were softer underfoot than expected, the ground neither cold nor damp, just supportive, like old slippers or a well-mannered bench. The path was clearer now, marked by stones that didn't look placed, but agreed upon by the land itself. Brigitte walked slowly, not to be cautious, but because haste had never helped in any of this, and seemed unlikely to start now. The pendant around her neck continued to hum, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to let her know it remembered what it was. As she walked, the hills began to show small signs of life. Not animals, not people, but objects half settled into the earth, as if the world had once been a shelf, and these were the things it had forgotten to dust. A teacup nestled in a clump of moss. A shoe not worn, but waiting. A small bell that rang softly as she passed, even though she hadn't touched it. Don't paused to sniff each item respectfully, occasionally glancing up as if to say, yes, this is odd, but not the alarming kind. The path led to a clearing where a single tree stood tall and without leaves, though it did not look dead. Its bark bore the same spiral pattern as the disc she had placed back in the chamber, and at its base a stone bench had been carved, not recently, but carefully, with a backrest shaped like folded wings and armrests worn smooth by use or by wind. It was hard to say. Brigitte sat. The moment she did, the world around her stilled. Not froze, there was still breath in the air, still a quiet rustling in the knot leaves of the tree, but stilled as though time had taken a knee out of respect. Don't lay beside her. The pendant dimmed. From somewhere overhead came a soft chime, the same tone she had heard when the drawers had opened round and complete and somehow familiar. The book in her hands, still open to the single page, now glowed faintly along the edges, and new writing appeared just beneath the first phrase. She watched it form the letters, rising from the page like steam from a morning mug. It read, "The place before the beginning is not behind." She read it aloud once, just to hear it in the air. The clearing seemed to nod. A soft breeze passed through, not through the leaves, since there were none, but through the pattern itself, stirring the spiral, so it seemed just for a moment to move. And then the bench beneath her shifted, not in a way that suggested instability, but more like someone beneath it had just stood up. She rose, turned slowly, and saw behind the tree a small door, not in the trunk, not attached to any structure. Just a door freestanding, made of pale wood, and carved with the same symbol on her pendant, though here it was reversed, as if mirrored or flipped after printing. She approached. It didn't have a handle, only a small indentation in the center, the same size as the pendant. Brigitte touched the pendant gently, then pressed it into the hollow. The door opened. Not outward, not inward, just away, as if the world had blinked and decided to leave a space. Beyond it was not another forest, not more hills, but a corridor made of light. Not blinding, not shimmering, just light. Plain and steady, the kind that reveals only what wants to be seen. She stepped through. Don't followed, always a few paces behind a silent participant in whatever this had become. The corridor bent gently to the right, then straightened, and along its walls were shelves, not of objects this time, but of moments. She could see them faintly, like shadows cast by memory. A birthday, she never had a winter that came too early, a song someone once hummed and forgot. These weren't hers. Or perhaps they were. Or perhaps they would be. The corridor led to a room shaped like a keyhole, rounded at one end, and narrowing to a single point at the other, where a pedestal stood. Upon it sat the final piece, or so it seemed. A fourth object, one she had never seen yet immediately recognized. It was shaped like nothing she'd seen, and everything she remembered, a form that didn't make sense until she was standing before it. And then it made no sense that it could have ever not existed. The fourth object sat quietly atop the pedestal at the narrow end of the keyhole-shaped room, as if it had been placed there by someone who knew she would arrive. Eventually, not in haste, not with fanfare, but simply because things tend to end where they begin, and begin where they're left waiting. It wasn't round like the carved disc, nor smooth like the second, nor angled like the third. It was irregular, a little asymmetrical, with edges that didn't quite meet cleanly, and curves that changed slightly, depending on how she looked at them. It appeared at first to be made of stone, but not cold stone. This one breathed warmth, a kind of subtle inner glow that pulsed in a way not unlike a heart, remembering it still had a job. Brigitte reached out slowly, not with caution, but with the kind of reverence reserved for things that are known before they're named. Her fingers closed around it, and the object yielded, just slightly settling into her palm with the ease of something that had been measured for that hand long before either of them had names. As soon as she lifted it, the room responded, not with sound, but with acknowledgement. The light shifted, the walls exhaled, and the long, narrow corridor behind her folded inward, slightly, not closing, but making space like a crowd stepping aside to let someone pass. Don't approached now, stopping just beside her eyes on the object tail still. Brigitte didn't speak. The object didn't glow or hum or pulse in any theatrical way, but it felt undeniably alive, as if it knew it had been missing and was quietly delighted to be back in circulation. She turned it over in her hand. There were markings not carved, but present etched, not on the surface, but within like veins in a leaf, or veins in a truth. Lines that moved slightly when not watched, forming different shapes, like the memory of something that had been folded many times and still carried the creases. On instinct, she held it close to the pendant on her chest. The two made contact. A pause. Then warmth. Not heat. Not power. Warmth, the kind that comes from something familiar, like a room you haven't entered in years, that still smells like your grandmother's shawl. The corridor behind them dimmed slightly, not into shadow, but into privacy, as if the room had politely decided not to witness what came next. The pedestal now empty, began to recede into the floor. Not vanishing, just stepping back into the earth like a stagehand finished with their cue. And then the room moved, not rotated, not expanded, but shifted subtly, revealing behind the now vanished pedestal a panel in the wall, nearly invisible, before now faintly pulsing with the same quiet rhythm as the object in her hand. She stepped forward. The panel responded, sliding open with no sound, only a whisper of displaced air. Behind it was a chamber even smaller than this. No wider than her outstretched arms, its walls lined with mirrored surfaces that didn't reflect her face, but her intentions, her questions, her half-formed hopes, her unspoken conclusions. And in the center, a stand holding 5 empty sockets. She paused, counted again. 5. Not 4. She looked down at the object in her hand, then back at the pendant, and then toward the mirrored walls, which now shimmered slightly, revealing not reflections, but possibilities. Each socket was shaped differently. One perfectly round, another slightly cupped, another shaped like the spiral she had seen so often before. The fourth irregular mirrored the shape she now held. But the fifth, well, the fifth wasn't shaped at all. It simply was. A space defined not by borders, but by absence, like a sentence missing only the final word. Brigitte stepped closer. She placed the irregular piece in its matching socket. It settled in with a sigh, a warmth spreading gently up her fingers, as if in thanks. The other 3, round, smooth, and angular, appeared beside her, now though she had not carried them. Perhaps they had followed. Perhaps they had waited. She placed them one by one, and with each the mirrored walls shifted, not changed, shifted, showing new angles, new colors, new rooms she had never seen, or might never see, or might already have seen in the quietest hours between sleep and waking. Only the 5th socket remained, still shapeless, still waiting. Don't nudged her gently, not with urgency, but with a kind of patient reminder, the way dogs often do when they feel something important has almost been forgotten. She looked again at the pendant. It pulsed once, and then she understood. The 5th piece wasn't missing. It was not a thing. It was her. Or rather, it was presence, awareness, the act of bearing witness. She stepped forward, not to place anything, but to simply stand in alignment. The moment she did, the final socket glowed faintly, not to accept, but to acknowledge. And then the wall before her, silent until now, opened into light again. Not blinding, not brilliant, just warm, calm, almost beige, if light can be beige. A room waited on the other side, round again, familiar, but not the one from before. This one held something else. Not drawers, not books, but something else entirely. Something that didn't ask to be understood, but invited understanding anyway. Slowly, like tea, cooling beside a letter that had never quite been sent. The round room beyond the soft light was quiet, as expected, but not in the way of empty places. This was the quiet of presence, of attention, that had never left, even when no one had come to visit for a very long time. Brigitte stepped inside. Don't just behind her. Both of them, crossing the threshold without hesitation and without fanfare, as if their arrival had been anticipated. So thoroughly, the room felt no need to react. The walls were smooth, lined with vertical wooden panels that bore no symbols, no patterns, and yet the grain itself swirled in faint natural spirals, as if the trees used to build the chamber had grown in circles, rather than lines, slowly winding inward, one ring for each quiet year spent not being furniture. In the center of the room stood a low table, upon it 5 chairs. Not around it, as chairs generally are, but arranged in a crescent, all facing one direction toward a single window. Not a window to the outside, not in the usual way. This one looked out into something less definite, more like a view across time, or feeling a slow-moving landscape that changed not with weather, but with mood. Brigitte approached the table. On its surface were items not artifacts or relics, but ordinary things made extraordinary by the fact of their being here. A thimble, a folded bit of linen embroidered with a single, careful spiral. A candle with no wick. A spool of thread with nothing wrapped around it. And a single cup half full of water that didn't ripple even as she leaned over it. She reached for the thimble first. It was heavy, more than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of all the fingers it had ever protected. Turning it over, she saw an inscription too small to read, but she didn't need to. Its shape was familiar, the lines forming a version of the same symbol etched into the book she still carried. She set it down. The linen was next. When she picked it up, the embroidery warmed in her hand just slightly, as though it remembered being stitched on a long afternoon when rain had promised to fall, but never quite did. It smelled faintly of rosemary, not dried, fresh. She unfolded it gently. Inside, surprisingly, was another object, a small stone no larger than a beetle, smooth and round, with a single notch carved into one side. It didn't match any of the other objects she had seen, but it did something unexpected the moment it rested in her palm. The view from the window changed. Slowly, subtly, the scene shifted from gray-green mist to something warmer, a field, perhaps, or a clearing, filled with a kind of light that suggested stories had been told there often, even if no one remembered what they were. Don't stared through the window, 2 ears alert, tail still. The candle and thread remained untouched, as if they knew their time hadn't come yet. Brigitte placed the stone on the table beside the thimble and linen, and the water in the cup shimmered, not with movement, with light. A soft gold, the color of warmth, remembered not seen. She turned back toward the chairs. They hadn't moved. Of course they hadn't. But now they felt more like seats prepared than furniture arranged. She sat in the center one, and the moment she did, the chair adjusted, not in any physical way, but in temperature and angle, as if acknowledging her presence with the courtesy of a favorite cushion. The others remained still, though the one on her right now bore a faint impression, as though someone else had once sat there long enough to leave a trace. Not a ghost, not a shadow, just memory again shaped into absence. Brigitte looked once more at the window. The view now flickered slightly, like a page being flipped behind glass, and for a moment she saw her cottage, not as it was, but as it might have been, with the fire crackling, the siblings sleeping soundly, the broom still upright. But the scene was slower, like a painting caught in the act of becoming. She blinked, and it changed again this time to the circular room of drawers, now lit by candlelight, and faintly humming the drawers half open, as if waiting for her return. She blinked again. The view softened back to the clearing with the tree. The stone she had placed on the table pulsed once, and from somewhere in the room came a soft creaking, wood on wood, not loud, not demanding, just suggestive. She stood. The candle now glowed at its base, even without a wick. A low flame, quiet and blue, hovered an inch above it. She reached toward it, and the air around her hands grew warmer, not hot, but aware, as if the flame had asked her to consider what it meant to touch light. She didn't take the candle, just stood with it. And as she stood there, the thread on the table began to wind itself slowly, carefully, around an invisible spindle. It spun without sound, drawing from somewhere unseen. And as it did, the final chair, the one furthest left, shifted slightly, just enough to creak its agreement. Brigitte turned, sat again, waited. The cup of water shimmered a second time. The window dimmed, and from beneath the table came a sound she hadn't expected, a slow, deliberate knock. Not sharp, not desperate, just 3 soft taps, evenly spaced. Don't stood. Brigitte leaned down. The knock came again, and then 3 knocks, soft and evenly spaced, with just enough pause between them to make certain they were separate, and not simply echoes of one uncertain tap. Brigitte didn't move at first. She looked to Don't, who had turned his head slightly toward the base of the table, but had not growled, barked, or even twitched, only watched, as though he too understood that whatever this was didn't warrant alarm, only acknowledgement. The room remained warm. The candle's blue flame flickered, once then held steady. The window stayed dim, its landscape unchanged, still fixed on the field that now seemed suspended, not in space, but in consideration. Brigitte leaned forward slowly, her hand brushing the table's smooth edge, and lowered herself until her chin nearly met her knees, peering beneath the table. She expected, perhaps, a compartment or a hinge, a door hidden in the grain, but instead, she saw another chair, small, narrow, tucked under the table, with the bashful posture of a guest who arrived too early and hoped not to be noticed. On the seat of this chair sat a bundle, wrapped in a deep brown cloth, knotted precisely once in the center. It rested there as though someone had left it just moments before and would return any second to retrieve it, except the dust on the legs of the chair told a different story. She reached under, careful not to bump her head, and slid the bundle toward her. It was lighter than expected, but firm, not soft, like folded clothes or loose papers. When she untied the knot, the cloth fell away in soft, tired folds, revealing a box. Small, square, made of dark wood, with corners reinforced by bull brass. No lock, no seal. Only a tiny spiral etched onto the top, more worn than the others she'd seen, like it had been touched too often by fingers that didn't quite know why they reached for it. She held it in her lap, staring for a long moment before lifting the lid. Inside were 5 objects, not arranged, not nestled in velvet, just placed. One was a marble glassy and gray, with a tiny crack running through its center that caught the light in a way that made it look like it might whisper if rolled across a smooth surface. Another was a button, wooden with 4 holes and no thread, the kind you might find tucked in a pocket for decades, not because it was needed, but because it had become too familiar to discard. The third was a dried sprig of something not lavender, but close. Maybe something older, a plant that had once meant something specific in a village now long since returned to moss and earth. The fourth was a slip of paper, folded into quarters, its edges frayed from handling. Brigitte opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn map, not of places, but of moments, 5 dots connected by curved lines, like someone had charted a dream. The fifth object was a key, not the kind that opened a door, but the kind meant for winding something. Small brass with a spiral worked into its handle. She held the key gently. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, the air changed, not chilled or warmed, but stilled again, like breath being held in every corner of the room. Don't sat now beside her feet, watching her with quiet interest, as though he too knew the shape of this key without ever having seen it. Brigitte placed the box carefully on the table beside the other items, and as soon as she did, the chair across from her creaked again, not in movement, but in memory, like it was remembering the last time it had hosted a conversation. The key in her hand pulsed once. The button beside it rolled slowly toward the edge of the box, not pushed, not dropped, just moved by a thought she hadn't quite had yet. Brigitte placed the key beside the candle. The blue flame leaned toward it only slightly, and then steadied. Across the room, something shifted. A panel in the wall, not hidden, but previously overlooked, as though its presence had been polite enough not to intrude, slid open. Behind it was not another corridor, not a passage, but a shelf, a single shelf, and upon it sat a clock, old round, with a face made of parchment under glass, its hands frozen, not at midnight or noon, but at a time that didn't exist, the space between 2 numbers. The place where decisions linger. Brigitte stood key in hand and crossed to it. The moment she lifted it from the shelf, the room grew quieter. Even the candle paused its flame, narrowing to a thin thread. The clock was heavier than expected, the kind of weight that suggests memory rather than machinery. She turned it over. In the back, a small opening, just the right size. She inserted the winding key and turned. Once, twice. A soft click, then ticking, slow, measured, familiar. And then quietly, the window across the room began to change. The field outside dimmed. The grasses lowered. The sky shifted from pale to dusky, rose, and a shadow moved across the horizon. Not fast, not ominous, just there, coming closer. Brigitte returned to the chair. The clock ticked once. The blue candle flickered. Don't stood and faced the window. And from within the ticking came something new. A sound. Not a chime. Not a bell. A voice. Not speaking. Not yet. Just drawing breath. Preparing. Waiting for. Just drawing breath, as if the voice had been waiting, not for a question, but for quiet enough to hear itself think. The room remained still, except for the ticking, steady now, each tick precisely measured, not rushed, not dragging, like it had rediscovered its rhythm after a long sleep. The voice did not emerge all at once, but slowly, carefully beginning as a low hum that might have been mistaken for the wind in a far-off corridor, or the murmur of old wood stretching back into place. Brigitte sat very still, the winding key still in her palm, her other hand resting lightly on the open box, her eyes on the changing window. The view had deepened. The figure in the distance now resolved into something less vague, not detailed, not distinct, but defined enough to know it was approaching with purpose. Don't stood beside her chair, not barking, not wagging, simply alert his ears, angled toward the clock, as though it were tuning itself to the voice just beginning to unfurl. Then finally, the voice spoke not in words, but in something older, something between breath and memory. Brigitte didn't understand it in any usual sense, but she understood it all the same. It was saying, "You have come far." Not far in distance, but in readiness. Not far in time, but in turning. It did not ask questions. It did not offer praise. It simply continued layering each phrase upon the last like blankets folded over a resting child. The candle flickered again, the flame thinning, then thickening, as if following the cadence of the voice. The ticking slowed just a touch, as if leaning in. Brigitte closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to see more clearly. With her eyes closed, the room around her remained, but also expanded. She felt not just the chair beneath her, but the chair beside it, the one across, the one still bearing the echo of someone long gone, or never quite here. She felt the presence of each item on the table, not as objects, but as roles played in a quiet story, the thimble as a promise of care, the thread as the passage of time, the marble as a decision cracked in two, but still whole, the button as something lost and found, again the candle as the last light before rest. The voice continued, growing no louder, but more distinct. "You are the fifth," it said, though Brigitte wasn't sure if she was meant to reply. "You are not the first, nor the last, but the fifth, who came when silence was ripe." A pause. "Then you brought your own peace." That was always the rule. The window shifted again. The field faded. Now it showed a circle of stones, half sunk into moss under a night sky, the color of old slate. She opened her eyes. The room was the same. The voice gone quiet again, or perhaps just waiting. The clock ticked. She looked at it, now the hands slowly turning, not to mark time, but to trace a spiral. They didn't move around the face in a circle, but inward, tick by tick, deeper toward the center, like the spiral drawn on the pendant, the stone, the drawer labels. The same shape again and again, folding in. Don't gave a low huff, not quite a sigh, not quite speech, and nudged her knee. She stood. The clock still ticking, didn't object. The view in the window now brightened slightly, revealing that the stones were arranged not randomly, but in the same pattern as the chamber where the pieces had been placed. She stepped closer, and the window's edge shimmered, not glass now, but a membrane, something that could be passed through like steam, or curtain, or time. Brigitte didn't hesitate. She stepped forward. The moment she did, the air changed, not in temperature or scent, but in texture, like walking through memory that hadn't quite finished forming. The landscape was quiet, the sky unmoving. The stones stood tall, some leaning slightly, some solid in the earth. Don't walked beside her, his paw prints, leaving no mark. She walked to the center of the circle, and as she did, each stone glowed faintly, not brightly, just enough to say, yes, we remember. In the center, a platform, not raised, not sunken, just flat and deliberate. On it, a single chair, older than the others, covered in symbols, worn soft. She did not sit, not yet. Around the circle, faint outlines, moved shadows of others. Not people, not spirits, presences. The ones before, the others. The voice came again, not from the sky, not the earth. From within. It said, "We left the space. You brought the center. We left the shape. You brought the time." The chair before her warmed, not beckoning, not commanding, just ready. She stepped toward it, the key still in her hand. The final item, perhaps, or the first one misunderstood. She sat. The chair settled around her, and the sky above began to move not with stars, but with spirals unfolding outward, now not inward. The spiral reversed. The clock ticked once more. And then the spiral began to turn outward, not fast, not abrupt, but with the slow, generous rhythm of something that had been closed for a long time and was now ready to breathe again. The stars, or what passed for stars, didn't twinkle, but blinked on like thoughtful punctuation, dotting the spiral's path with the kind of order that suggests someone somewhere was still keeping careful notes. Brigitte sat in the chair at the center of the stone circle, not as a ruler, not as a guest, but as a participant, one among others, though the others now existed only as presence, as shimmer, as warmth just out of reach. The key in her hand pulsed once, then faded to stillness, as if it had completed the last turn it had been made to perform. Don't lay down beside the chair, his head resting on his paws, watching the reverse spiral with the quiet alertness of someone who'd seen this sort of thing before, but didn't want to make a fuss about it. The stones around the circle glowed faintly, their light softening the shadows cast by the strange not stars above. Each stone bore a symbol, now previously hidden, now illuminated simple shapes carved deep into their surfaces. A cup, a spool, a hand, a flame, a spiral. Brigitte looked from one to the next, her gaze moving slowly, not to understand, but to notice. The spiral above continued to unwind, and as it did, something new began to happen. The air within the circle shimmered not with heat or motion, but with the peculiar density of memory made visible. It started at the edge near the stones and moved inward in gentle waves until the center where Brigitte sat became enclosed in what could only be called a shape of time, a sphere almost, but not quite. More like a space folded around itself carefully, like sheets turned down at the edge of a bed. Inside this space, sound faded not completely, but into a muffled softness that made every movement feel more deliberate, more considered. The ticking from the clock was gone now. Or rather, it continued elsewhere, behind the veil of this enclosed moment. Brigitte looked down at her lap, where the key still rested, and beside it now lay the folded map, the one from the box, the one with 5 dots, and no names. It had unfolded itself again, but the dots were moving slowly, shifting, tracing paths that curved in accordance with the spiral above, now stretching wider, longer outward still. A soft hum began, not from the sky, not from the ground, but from the chair itself, or perhaps from the stone beneath it. The tone was low, steady, the sound of something remembering, not where it had been, but why it had stayed there. The presence of others grew clearer now, not forms, not figures, but sensations, the feeling of being watched with affection, of being included without explanation, of being welcomed back without fanfare. The chair warmed beneath her, the fabric worn to comfort over centuries of forgetfulness. Brigitte closed her eyes, not to rest, but to listen more fully. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw more clearly than she expected. A series of doors, not physical, not literal, but real enough to knock against with thought. Each door bore a familiar mark: the candle, the thread, the map, the disc, the pendant. Each opened in a different direction, and each revealed not places, but questions. Simple ones, uncomplicated. What did you carry with you that no one asked for? What do you still know that has no name? What waited for you while you forgot it? Where is the center, if not here and last? Can you rest knowing it's unfinished? She didn't speak the answers. She didn't need to. The questions folded inward, joined the spiral, continued to turn. When she opened her eyes again, the view above had shifted once more. The stars, if they were stars, had now arranged themselves into 5 larger shapes, each echoing the marks from the drawer labels: stillness, absence, moth, fog, last word. They pulsed gently, one after the other, in a rhythm that felt like breath, deep and slow, and meant to continue. And then, from the edge of the circle, came another change. The 6th stone, the one without a symbol, shimmered, and from it rose a new line, a faint glowing thread stretching up into the sky, reaching toward the center of the unwinding spiral. Not fast, not forceful, just intentional. The thread grew, and as it did, the sky began to answer. From the center of the spiral, a line of light descended faint, at first, then sharper, as if returning the gesture. The 2 threads met, hesitated, and then joined, not in a flash, not with noise, but with a sigh that filled the entire circle, a sigh that felt like the end of a very old story, or the middle of a very new one. The chair beneath Brigitte stilled. The hum faded. The key cooled completely, and in the stillness that followed, a single sound emerged not from within, not from beyond, but from just beside her. Don't had stood up. His nose pointed toward the ground beside the chair, where something new now waited. A doorway, low, narrow-edged in stone, with no handle, no hinges, only the same familiar spiral carved faintly into its lintel. It pulsed once, just once, as if to say, "When you're ready." "When you're ready," the spiral seemed to say, not urgently, not expectantly, just as a matter of polite routine, like a friend tapping their teacup with a spoon to gently remind you that the water's steeped long enough. Brigitte looked down at the door, which had not appeared in any flash or tremble, but had simply been there all along, perhaps waiting beneath the chair, perhaps in the very shape of the ground, perhaps tucked inside the pattern of her own footsteps waiting to be stepped toward. Don't stood beside it, now not looking at her, but at the spiral above the lintel, his tail motionless, his breath steady. The air around the chair was warmer now, not from any fire, not from any sun, just from use, from long sitting, from thought and presence, and the kind of memory that leaves behind a temperature. Brigitte stood. The chair made no sound, but the grass beneath it sighed slightly as the shape of her rested weight disappeared. She stepped forward. The doorway did not change, but something in the atmosphere did some small shift, like when you pass through a threshold at home and your shoulders relax without you telling them to. The door itself was short low enough that she'd need to duck slightly, and wide in a way that suggested comfort, not grandeur. She stepped down into it, the stone underfoot, cool and firm, but not unfriendly. Don't followed. The air beyond the threshold smelled of something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps old bread, perhaps pages that had been closed too long, perhaps just distance in its quietest form. The hallway was narrow and circular, its walls curved inward like the inside of a seashell, and lined with the faintest grooves, each one turning slightly, each one spiraling inward in ways that were not dizzying, but soothing, like being gently spun in a chair you didn't want to stop. There were no torches, no lamps, and yet there was light, not cast, not flickering, but present, as though the stone itself had been told to glow in the company of those who arrived with the right intent. As they walked, Brigitte noticed marks along the grooves, tiny symbols, repetitions of the ones she had come to recognize, the thimble, the flame, the thread, the hand. But now they were joined by others, new ones, subtle and simple, a boot print, a question mark, curled like a fern, a kettle with steam, drawn rising in tiny spirals. She walked slower now, not from fatigue, but from attention. The air here didn't rush. It was not designed for speed. It was designed for seeing. The spiral continued inward, not deeper, not downward, just closer, closer to something that had been just beyond each layer of understanding, each room, each tick, each soft drawer and quiet door. Finally, the corridor opened. Not dramatically, just widened like a path that's been walked enough times to flatten the edges. Ahead was a room round again, because of course it was with no ceiling, only sky. The sky was not night, not day. It was the color of first thoughts in the morning before the curtains are drawn. The center of the room held a pool, not water, not glass, but something like stillness given shape. Around it sat 5 cushions each in a different fabric, 1 velvet, 1 wool, 1 linen, 1 patched from many cloths, 1 so smooth it may have been woven from the wind. Brigitte stood at the edge. Don't waited just behind. In the center of the pool floated a single object, a disk. Not carved, not labeled just there. A plain circle like the period at the end of a long, meandering letter that somehow said exactly enough. She stepped forward. The moment her feet reached the edge of the pool, the disk drifted toward her, slow, sure as if drawn not by gravity or current, but recognition. She reached out. It stopped just within reach, and as she touched it, the symbols along its edge appeared not etched, but lit, glowing gently. They were the same symbols she had encountered through the rooms, the maps, the drawers. But now they moved, shifting slowly in a quiet circle, forming new sequences, new sentences that didn't need translation because they weren't made of words. The pool below rippled. A sound rose not from it, not from her, not from the room, but from the space where a story pauses to stretch before it continues. A sound like pages turning in a book you've already read, but somehow forgotten the best part of. Brigitte held the disk. It felt neither heavy nor light, just appropriate, the way a kettle feels when it's ready to pour, or a blanket when it's been folded just right. Around the edges of the room, the sky remained open, revealing a spiral, not above, but within the sky itself, curved now, drawing in as the earlier one had unwound, making a shape that felt like resting, like finishing, like readiness. Don't sat beside her now, tail curled, watching her as if to say, you've reached the middle, which if you've been paying attention, was never that far from the beginning. Brigitte sat, the pool stilled. The disk hovered just above her hands, and the room, this final room, or perhaps the first, began to